Welcome to our Charcha. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this Charcha, Preeta Sen. Preeta Sen is a widely known chef consultant and has been described variously as a food ethnographer, food anthropologist, and food historian. She has been a pioneer on multiple platforms, including social media, in creating awareness about the wisdom of the culinary culture of India. She has showcased what she terms indigenous heritage cuisine at several highly acclaimed and successful events in Gurgaon, Delhi, Kolkata, Mumbai, and Hyderabad. Considered a leading authority in regional cuisines, her work has been covered widely by media. She also comes with 3 decades of experience in journalism and strategic knowledge aggregation for national and international donor agencies and nonprofits. Her work in sustainable livelihoods and documentation in the development space spans sector publications in India and abroad. Welcome, Preeta. Over to you now.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be on this panel because each of our panelists today come with very special knowledge and they can be considered a storehouse of knowledge on the sector that I work with, and that is something that is important to all of us, which is food. And our first panelist today is Shubhra Chatterjee. Shubhra is this very young person with a vast appetite for digging out the secrets of our regional cuisine. She is also known as History Wali on Instagram. Check her out there. Is a food researcher, writer, and director who has traveled around India for the last 10 years to document its culture, history, and in particular, culinary heritage. She has created television shows like Chakle India, Kacha Rasta on NDTV Good Times, and Ekant, Indiepedia, and Lost Recipes on Epic Channel, amongst others. She's also the face of a popular Instagram live series called History on a Plate. She has over the years become drawn to documenting the lesser known food cultures and cuisines of India and hopes to put the spotlight on such traditions and recipes through her work. Shubhra has been behind a number of culinary conferences focusing on Indian food, such as Desi cultures, on the fermented foods of India and the food of the Mughals. Now, that's a lot of work packed into a very young life. Congratulations, Shubhra. I didn't know so many things about you. She's also currently working on a book on the culinary culture of India, Rasa, commissioned by Hatchet Press. She is the co-founder of www.tonsvalley.shop, an online marketplace that is the face of a social enterprise that aims to enable and empower the small-scale farmers of the Upper Tons Valley in Uttarkashi, Uttarakhand. Our next panelist is Vikram Doctor, whose writings I have followed for a very long time and I hugely admire. He is an encyclopedic source on the cooking life of Mumbai. Vikram Doctor has spent years tracking down and documenting the things that many other cooks, eaters, readers, and even fellow food writers routinely take for granted. In his writing and through his much loved Real Food podcast, Vikram cast a wide net over the mayhem of topics that make up modern Indian food and its history, from the provenance and shifting fortunes of the sugar cube to the decidedly mixed ways in which the Green Revolution is received by Indians depending on their ideological inclinations. His frank, clear-eyed investigation of regional Indian food is as much a testament to his refreshingly old-school journalistic ethic as it is to his almost axiomatic belief that one needn't be seated at the most elaborate tables, I agree on this totally, to take part in the enriching and illuminating comestible life of a place. His work reaffirms that life is thriving everywhere in Mumbai in the work of ingenious small-scale food entrepreneurs, in the cuisines of proud and insular communities breaking out of their isolation through the act of sharing their food, and in the constant machinery of immigration that draws people of every economic station to the city. This is wonderful, Vikram, and we hope to hear more on this from you on this panel.
Yeah, it's a wonderful introduction. I don't know who wrote it, but thank you, whoever did that.
And then we have someone who I call the original excavator. Not only does he dig earth, he also digs out food and has this wonderful food service which dishes out one Parsi dish after another. And he is none other than Dr. Kurush Dalal, who is an archaeologist, historian, food anthropologist, and raconteur. He has a PhD on the early Iron Age from Pune University, but subsequently shifted focus to the early medieval and colonial periods. He was an assistant professor of the archaeology department at the University of Mumbai and the co-director of the Salsette Explorations Project, which documented the archaeology of Mumbai. He currently teaches archaeology and its allied disciplines at the INSTUCEN Trust. He writes and consults with Live History of India and runs his own culinary anthropology workshops. Dr. Dalal also owns Katie's Kitchen, a beloved and popular Mumbai catering service specializing in ethnic Parsi food. So there you are, we have our panelists, and our topic today is something very interesting, and it's how mythology and the ancient storytelling traditions have shaped our cuisines, the ties that bind. Now, this topic is really vast. Our food traditions are completely intertwined with our mythology, or the other way around, mythology intertwined with our food traditions. And our India has always been a culture of storytelling, of oral history. And it has come down through the centuries. And I'm going to begin the discussion with Dr. Dalal, because like I said, that he's the original excavator, digging deep into history. So, Kurush, my question to you is that there has been a long relationship and deep relationship with food, mythology, storytelling, rituals in our culture. Now, how would you interpret this vis-a-vis the archaeology that you do when you get deep into your archaeological excavations? Does food throw a lot of light on the cultures that existed then?
Okay, so I hope we've got about 4 or 5 hours just for this answer. But to put it very, very simply, Preetha, breathing and sleeping are involuntary. Eating is voluntary. It's the one voluntary thing that you have to do to stay alive. Ever since human beings have gained cognition to some degree or the other, they've realized that their food sources are critically important to their survival. You eat to live. Live to eat comes much later when you have surplus. The way we eat today is essentially the result of about 11,000 years of the past, which is essentially the Neolithic Revolution and the change to becoming food producers from food gatherers, which doesn't mean we stop gathering. This itself was an incredibly dangerous and fraught time. The vagaries of nature decided whether you were going to survive the next year or not. The vagaries of nature, till very recently in India, for example, have decided whether or not your grandchildren will survive, whether or not your grandparents will stop eating because there's not enough food in the family. So automatically this creates an enormous amount of myth making. And some of this, not very much, but some of this we can see it reflected in our traditions. So in a country like India, it's a beautiful place to study this. This anthropologist is me talking, so apologies to everybody who doesn't like me for being politically incorrect. But if you look at the very simple fact that Indian religion and Indian mythology are deeply intertwined, we cannot really separate one from the other. To us, our myths are our traditions and our religion, and our traditions and our religion are a part and parcel of our myths. It's kind of inseparable. So if you look at the archaeological record, you start by seeing simple things like the propitiation of the dead, and you see food being packed with the dead. And all over the Harappan sphere and even in the Chalcolithic, we see food being placed with the dead. And we see the dead being buried under the houses in which they live. This automatically tells you that there is a very, very strong belief and a very strong relationship in the afterlife and the use of food in the afterlife. We also see the concept of sacrifice. And sacrifice is almost always for propitiation. And who are you propitiating? You're propitiating essentially all the different forces of nature. And these forces all play a role in feeding you. So the ethnoarchaeological work that we've done, the ethnographic work that we've done, and the archaeological work that we've done, all points towards this fact that a lot of our festivals, a lot of our celebrations, and all of our lives were deeply impacted and deeply ritualized by these needs to explain the unexplainable. And this is where we basically see all the myths in our traditions.
Thank you. That was very enlightening. My next question, carries on to Shubhra. Shubhra, you have been working in different regions, in different geographies. I just heard you say that you're sitting somewhere where temperatures are below zero, and soon you'll be in Orissa and, the warmer climes. Now, you have worked, very deeply with regional cuisines. And so how do you see this entire panning out of what Kurush just told us about how food was actually sacred, and the same food in the various regions that you've traveled in, how do you see the interpretations changing or the associations changing? If we could have an example from you, like say rice, or say wheat, or say festive food, the same thing. How does it change, and why do you think it changes?
Before I go to why it changes, I would just like to point out one thing that I've noticed. Everywhere I have traveled in India and shot, the root is the same. The root of our thought, the root of our myths is somehow the same. And I believe, and I have come to the conclusion that this is based in the fact that we believe in the Hindu thought, it is believed that Annam is Brahma, that food is God. And also the fact that all beings originate from Annam, sustain from it, and finally merge into it. It's a core thought that, emerges in the Taittiriya Upanishad, and then it carries on to form the foundation of our attitude to food. So whatever myths you have in different places, this is basically why food is sacred to us. It is the idea of bhog. And bhog here is not food which is cooked and offered to the gods. Bhog is all of material existence. There is this beautiful, we essentially worship gods for bhog, which is for material, for wealth, to become wealthy. We worship gods for yog, which is for spiritual advancement, for veer, which is, to win wars and to get bravery and courage, and for abhicharika, which is to harm our enemies. So these are the 4 kinds of murtis that we have. And the bhog murtis are the ones which are you know, the most only worshipped, as you will see, like you will never, there are very few instances of Abhicharika Murtis, for examples. The Veer Murtis will be at the, you know, just outside the villages, protecting the villages, you know, from invasions or from harm. But the Bhog Murtis are the main Murtis. And Bhog is all of material culture, which is also illustrated in what I call the first myth of food, which is the myth of Annapurna, you know, where Shiv and Parvati are engaged in this game of dice, and she is winning, Parvati is winning, and Shiv is like a sore loser. So he's like, you know, everything is going, he's gambled away everything. And in the end, he tells her that none of this matters, you know, it is what matters is me, what matters is spiritual advancement. And Parvati gets really upset, and she's like, okay, I will show you that this matters. And she walks away, she leaves. And when she leaves, all of the earth is plunged into a famine, a ravaging famine, and people are going hungry. And Shiv is finally forced to beg Parvati to come back. And so she comes back in the form of Annapurna and feeds the people. So the very thought that food is sacred in India, you know, is underlined by this belief that Annam is Brahma. And this, you know, emerges, this translates into different stories in different parts of the country. You know, the same myth has different connotations everywhere. In one, like for example, if you just see the celebration, like we just have Navratri happening, and Navratri is when it's rooted in a harvest festival. It is basically the harvest of rice at that time, which is being celebrated around the country, whether it is in the making of bhog and giving to Ma Durga, or it is in the Batukamma in Andhra Pradesh, where you have, you know, 9 different kinds of rice dishes made and offered to Gauri. So it's, you see it in these various forms, but it's essentially the root I found is the same, at least as far as Hindu thought is concerned. You know, this is of course changed later with time, with other religions coming in, with other philosophies and thoughts coming in, whether it's the Jain philosophy or Buddhist philosophy or Islamic, you know, philosophies, or Christian, or the Abrahamic religions. So, but the root is essentially the same.
That was very interesting, because when you talked about the Annapurna story, it's one interpretation is Bengal is after this, Shiv pleads with Parvati to sow Panchashashya, as we call it, 5 different grains.
Right.
And that was typical of the region, like barley, sesame seeds, mustard seeds, and 2 others I'm forgetting. But so every region has its own interpretation of the same story, and it is what is so important to our sustenance. That is the thing. Let me move on to.
I have a question for you here. Some of the main books that describe, I've forgotten the name of the text at the moment, that describes the realm of Annapurna is in Bengali, right?
Annada Mongol.
Yes, exactly. Do you know a bit about this? Unfortunately, I think there's only recently been an English translation, which I haven't read yet. But I'm very curious about this text. Do you know anything about it?
Well, I do. And if I start on it, it will take up a lot of time. We can have the conversation offline, I think, Vikram. But there it gives you a picture of, it's a social narrative, basically. You know, it's part of what we call the Mangal Kavyas in Bengal from the 15th, though I feel it started slightly earlier, but it's 15th to almost the 18th century. And it was actually a complete social narrative of the times. And so this can be another session, I think, Vikram.
But it's based in a description of the city of Annapurna, right? Or the realm of Annapurna.
Realm of Annapurna.
Okay.
The realm of Annapurna.
Okay.
Which is basically Mother Earth and sustenance.
Okay. Sorry.
What I find fascinating is that all of these early stories talk about Bali. Something that all of us now almost think of as a mythical grain.
Unless you drink beer, Kurush.
But even beer is going the rice way, which is very interesting. So, you know, just thinking about it, that we've completely forgotten barley. It's become a mythic grain, and that's the reverse of
But
what we're talking
it
about
was
today.
the original grain,
Always,
and
always.
It was also akshat. Akshat was barley before it was rice. What
Yeah.
you offer to the gods, yeah.
Yeah. So I carry on to Vikram. Vikram, you moving on from the entire regional scenario, we come into this entire micro, a metro situation, urban life. And you have been working with the food systems of the urban population, but the people who are very, very rooted to the ground. Can you tell us a little more about what it is that you've been actually working with, and what is it that you've been seeking from
Uh,
this?
I mean, actually, I no longer live in Bombay, to be honest. I mean, I live in Goa now. I mean, it's one of the changes of this year. But a lot of my work has just been following how traditions survive from because in India we don't have a clear division between urban and rural. The both exist together. The urban influences the rural influences the urban. People in cities are still in a sense are living like they are in villages, and so and all these traditions come together in food. And I was looking for something for a single idea, which one could maybe talk about, and which again I think connects with the other panelists, including yourself, because a lot of my focus, actually, to be honest, has not been mythology, but has been what I call material culture. The physical aspects of cooking, the how the things like the metals and the fuel and the ingredients that we use, shape the way we cook. And one thing that I think which emerges very clearly, is very central to Indian culture across India, is the pot, the earthen pot. And again, this is something I think all our panelists can relate to, because Kurush is, archaeologists are the only people who get excited by broken pots. And I think, I would love to hear Kurush tell us a little bit more about, what you learned from broken pots. And Shubhra, I think has seen the use of of pots and earthenware across India. And I'll just say what I think it's fascinating. And, Preeta, you also will have the experience of having cooked in earthen pots and the difference it makes. Even something like, not even just rice, even something like mishti doi, the difference mishti doi made in a earthen pot, which is hygroscopic and leaches out the water, to this horrible mishti doi, frankly, that you get in plastic containers these days. But the reason why I am really fascinated by earthen pots is they frame our lives in so many ways. We use them in rituals. We cook in them, we store water in them, and even when we die, our ashes are put in them. So, and somehow this metaphor of the earthen pot is so critical to India. Even the rounded shape, because that is what suits our cooking, which is determined by the fuel source, which has been essentially cow dung. Because in India, the reality is that we did not have many other sources of food. There was wood, of course, but I mean that is dependent on going out and collecting it, and in cities that is harder to get. Coal has never been an important resource until relatively recently. We have huge coal resources, but that's in the northeast, and the exploitation of those coal resources goes back 200 years. Not very much more than that, except in isolated communities. But cow dung is essential, and cow dung and earthen pots go together. It provides, it gives a slow sort of heat which will not crack a pot. On higher levels on higher heats, you do need metal, and we see that when as metal starts coming into India and metal pots start coming into India, we find newer sources of heat also coming in. So these are the things that really interest me. What I call how material culture links to our cultural imaginations, links to actually the way in which our food is cooked. And I would be fascinated, if you don't mind asking, from the other three panelists, including you, Preeta, like, what has your experience been of earthen pots and how they affect our food?
Should I go first?
Yeah, please.
Because I very recently had an experience. I mean,
Yeah.
these have been my questions too. I cooked the Durga Puja Bhog totally in earthen pots this time.
Really?
And yes, because I did not have my puja bartans with me, so therefore I bought these earthen pots, and so I cooked, and I found a few very, very interesting things, because I realized about heat conduction, huh? And why cooking in earthen pots has been considered safe, healthy, and somehow I do not know the scientific explanation for it. When I deep fried my vegetables in it, they did not absorb the kind of oil that
Wow.
they absorb when I almost had the same amount of oil left as before I started frying 3-4 vegetables. You know how brinjals absorb oil
Yeah.
when deep fried,
Yeah.
huh?
Sponges.
You
Yeah.
you know how cauliflower absorbs oil. Suddenly
Yeah.
you find you're left with nothing in your metal karai.
Yeah.
It's all gone in there. But
Yeah.
that did not happen.
It's fascinating.
Another thing I found was that my temperings did not burn. You know,
Wow.
you have stand the chance of this thing of the oil heating up suddenly, and you uh, put your chalk in and it's all burnt.
Yes.
Huh? That did not. I was cooking 3-4 things at the same time. I was at a deadline to meet. Bhog was at 11 o'clock. I had to finish by then. So I was cooking, and I was amazed that the oil had heated up. It took a long time to heat. I mean, it's slow cooking and what we call slow food.
Right.
Took a long time to heat, but none of my temperings burnt. And
Were you cooking on gas?
I was cooking on gas.
And
I
did
mean,
you have to adjust?
Vikram, don't push it. Wooden chula wula to nahi milega.
Listen, I'm in Goa. During lockdown, we didn't even have gas. I thought at some point I'd have to go and make a chula outside in my garden and like start cooking on it and go and get like gobar from the things. Luckily, the gas lasted till the end
I'm
of
going
lockdown.
to be in Goa end of the month for a month.
Yeah.
We'll catch up on the wooden fire cooking then.
Okay. Okay.
But there's something else I want to add.
Yeah.
When you
That's a threat, Vikram.
Now, don't make me out to be the scary person. I'm not. So, no, there's something else I want to add, that you're talking about the Mitti Ka Bartan and all our associations with it. It had also to do with health,
Yeah.
hygiene, and environment. Because I remember a ritual when I was a child. After my grandmother passed away, we never followed it. But the day before the Bengali New Year, what we call Chaitra Sankranti, and the last day of Chaitra, before the first day of Boishak, the kitchens were cleaned out, and we didn't have gas then. So we had mitti ka chulas, big mitti ka chulas. The mitti ka chulas used to be broken, all the old pots and the surais, or whatever mitti ka bartan we had to be all broken, and all old grains had to be cleaned out or thrown away, and you had to bring in fresh mitti ka bartans and build your chula again, and these had to be filled with fresh grains. Old moldy stuff, everything had to go.
Right.
No sunning it out or whatever. So, this entire cycle, it was an annual ritual. They're all connected.
I mean, and what you're saying also touches on an uncomfortable aspect of culture, which is caste. And the reason why in many contexts earthen bowls are used is because they can be broken after they're used. So, I mean, I'm not saying this is in your particular case that you told us about, but in other contexts, earthenware fits into the sort of hierarchies and issues involved with caste. I mean,
sure. And the end of this ritual was we had to throw fistfuls of barley ka sattu into the air.
Wow.
So I have never really figured out why. From what I have heard is that you are throwing away all the evil and the bad and everything and clearing the air, and it was with barley.
When was the last time you did this?
When I was 10 years old.
10 years old. Okay. Wow.
We had to go and stand at the Chaurasta, the road, that crossing. It had to be a Charwala Chaurasta, and stand there and crossroads, and throw fistfuls. My father used to be very annoyed, his children doing all that, but my grandmother insisted. So we had to do all that. So
there's some very interesting myths about crossroads, and why you do these things at crossroads. And these are not just Indian myths; these are across the world.
So tell us.
So crossroads basically confuse the spirits.
Okay.
Something like that.
And they don't know how to follow you home if you do something at a crossroads.
Okay.
Crossroads is also critically important turning point in people's lives. So they're incredibly powerful. And therefore, if you do something evil at a crossroads, that evil is that much more magnified than you would otherwise. So that's why you would hang somebody at a crossroads or kill somebody at a crossroads. And then that person would haunt the crossroads forever. So crossroads are therefore incredibly powerful places in the mythic world. And I'm sure Utkarsh and Arundhati can probably say much more about crossroads.
But Kurush, tell us, why do archaeologists love broken pots?
So there are about half a dozen reasons. The first thing about pottery is that, damn, once it breaks, you can't do anything about it. Yeah. I mean, unless you're Japanese and you have a lot of gold and you can put it back together. Yeah, but that only happens with very, very fancy pottery, which has a lot of very important stuff. And we actually have that in India also, though most people don't know about it. So deep in Amravati, in a stupa, we have a beautiful bowl that doesn't belong to that period at all. It is about 500 years older than the stupa over there. Wow. And it's been riveted together with copper rivets and metal bands. Wow. And there's a very strong belief that it's the Buddha's begging bowl. Oh, wow. It was enshrined as a Sharirika remain in the stupa itself. So, yeah, archaeologists get all like totally worked up about these things. Then don't tell other people about it. But apart from that, every single people's, therefore, since they use a lot of ceramic, because ceramic breaks easily and can't be recycled, create their own identity in ceramic. Since you're going to use a lot of it as a tableware and as a cookware, these are two completely different things, right? From the Hori past onwards, you create an identity of your own. So virtually every period, every geographical location, every moment in time has a ceramic that belongs to it. And archaeologists use these as markers to identify, various different periods. So even till quite recently, as archaeologists would like to believe that, a couple of thousand years ago is very recently, we can identify cultures purely on the basis of the tableware. Okay. The other thing is, because of what Preeta said and you said about, the hydroscopic properties of ceramics, especially unglazed ceramics and unslipped ceramics, they have a whole slew of very interesting properties that belong to them. Archaeologists love them because we now realize that food remains can survive for thousands of years inside these little pores. So we have the oldest recipe for what we call a curry in India, which is a brinjal curry, where we've actually managed to get the lipids of everything that went into making the dish out of that dish. So there was brinjal in it, there was turmeric in it, there was ginger in it, there was mustard oil in it. So we know that this was the basic preparation of brinjals about 4,500 years ago in Haryana.
Where were these? Haryana, okay.
This is Rakhi Gadi, Harappan site in Haryana. Okay. And one of the things that most archaeologists do with their pottery is they wash it so that they can see what's on it, because it's covered in mud and calcrete and various things depending on where it is. Now we stop washing it. Okay. Sometimes we wait 5 years to wash our ceramics, still samples have been taken by the chemical people, before we can go to the next step of understanding. And one of the amazing results just now from a lab in Canada of ceramics from Kutch, belonging to the Harappan period, is that we were making cheese in India. Wow. We were processing milk. We were making curd and cheese in India, cottage cheese. But we were doing this. Kalyan, who's working on this at a lab in this thing for his postdoc, has come up with some fantastic results from this site called Kotada Badli in the Kutch. So we look at it this way. So there is so many different ways we look at it. And there are such interesting ceramics which also show certain mythic religious affiliations. So you have the famous perforated jars of the Harappans, where everybody and his mother-in-law has an idea of what they did with it, including storing cabbages. They didn't have cabbages in India. Why would you store cabbages in perforated jars? But never mind that. There's even a beautiful one about women using it to smoke their hair, with incense. Yeah. And I think that's a fun idea. We haven't found any incense remains, but maybe we should start looking for them inside. There will be oils if incense was used. So ceramics do a lot of things like this. We get a lot of votive jars. One of the most interesting things about this kind of ceramic and myth and tradition comes from Karnataka. In Karnataka, we have these beautiful burials called cyst burials, which are, because of the stone available there, you can make these large slabs of stone and you make a blocky square house with a roof on top and you bury somebody under the ground under it. So these are very typical to this area. And some of them have a porthole. So in one of the sides, there is a hole cut into it. And you can actually look inside and it's an empty space because the body is under the ground. And the hole is for a very specific reason. Regularly, ritually, every year, you go and place a tiny pot, which is amazingly identical in shape and form to a lot of the pottery that was used and seen in the burial, which is regular size. And you have these toy-sized ones, or votive-sized ones, which are placed just inside. So you put your hand inside the hole and you leave behind things and offerings for the dead.
Wow.
So you're propitiating the dead. And we find these clusters of these little vessels at the mouth of the burial as such. So telling you that, ceramics can say a lot. When we found small ceramics like this in the past, we've always called them toy pots. What in Maharashtra we call bhatukli. But after looking at the stuff coming out of the burials in Karnataka, we've had to say, okay, these are not exactly toys. There's a lot of significance going behind this, which is not just children playing with it. And children play with some of the most odd things. Ringer Ringer Roses is one of the great fruits that is the children talking about the plague and those dying of plague, and we think it's a beautiful little rhyme that kids sing today.
Kurush, okay, sorry, I have a question, if I may ask it. The pot which was found at Farmana, on which the starch analysis was done for this turmeric brinjal curry, that was also a burial pot, wasn't it? It was food.
Yes. So we knew that this was filled with food and put there. So therefore we knew that the lipids we'd get out of it would be the last thing that was cooked in it, would have the best chance. But there's so much coming out of it. We now know about earliest beer making practices. We've been able to dig out yeasts that are hundreds of years old, if not thousands of years old, and revive these yeast strains and make beer out of them. So, one of the biggest things we did with grain was make beer. And I keep saying, bread is just a whole bunch of grains that missed out on becoming beer. So,
I have a question here, and I will lead it on to Shubhra with you. You said that one of the pots you found, you found that cheese making was happening there, right? Now, cheese or cottage cheese or fresh cheese or whatever, everything has been like taboo, after this entire caste hierarchy happened, and the myth is that the Portuguese came and taught us how to make cheese. No, we always knew how to make it, but it was because of the taboos that wasn't used. Now, my question to Shubhra will be that, a lot of myths attached to this cheese making, to paneer, to not being offered to the gods. And, even when I was living down south in the mid-80s, paneer was taboo there. I mean, people would look at me suspiciously and me thinking, oh, it's vegetarian, I'll carry it to work. No, I was, no, we can't eat that. That is not, what is that? No. So, what is it that you have discovered on your travels where this entire cheese, because, we have the kalari in Kashmir and we have the other kinds that the Gujars carry, and we have, so what has been your experience and what are the myths associated with it? Or have you found that there are no taboos where the actual region is concerned, where the communities are concerned, the grassroots communities? Is it all created by what we call the upper caste, the elite, the Brahminical culture?
So it's interesting that you bring this up, Preeta Di, because just last year, I think, it was last year when I was doing Lost Recipes, we, so all for the last few years, as I've been researching food and, trying to see how things are cooked in various cultures, the entire idea that the Portuguese taught us how to make cheese was prevalent. And I constantly felt that this wasn't the entire story,
No.
this wasn't the entire picture, because we have so much milk, we have so much dairy, and so there must have been something before. And last year when I was doing lost recipes in Karnataka, in Hampi actually, we cooked a recipe from the Manasolasa, which has been written in the 12th century by Someswara III, the Kalyani Chalukya king. And in that, there is written a recipe which teaches one how to spoil milk or break milk to make paneer. So over there, if you take milk and I'm trying to remember what exactly they used to break the milk. I think it was.
Was it an animal protein? Was it an animal enzyme?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. I mean, it was chas, which is an animal protein at the end of the day. So
No, but was it like rennet is used to make cheese? Was it an animal enzyme got from the stomach or something?
we're just using sour chas, and
They're using a beaten curd and adding it to milk and letting the milk split.
that's it. It was as simple as that. So they use. So that is what's written over there, and then they make a sweet with it. So they mix this cottage cheese that is got the milk solids with rice flour and sugar, and they make it into balls, and they fry the balls in ghee, and then
This
it's
is Rasgulla. You're talking about Rasgulla.
also again in Orissa at the Puri Jagannath temple, you have Rasgulla being made, and it is believed that it's been made the same way for the last 800 years, whereas the Portuguese only, came 500 years ago. So we did make things, we did spoil milk, we did make cottage cheese, and we did make things out of them, and this is being offered to Lord Jagannath. So I don't see a taboo over there,
So, Shubhra, I have a point to make there. The Rasgulla basically means disc in syrup. Gulla is a round thing, and Rosh is syrup. So, much like in Bengal, before the taboo about chena was broken, Sandesh was Sandesh, but it was made with coconut, it was made with thickened milk, it was made with lentil pastes and stuff, rice flour, but not chena, but it was still called Sandesh. So therefore, I am so sure that it was because chena that was conventional and traditional and orthodox. So point to contend with, but coming back to my question, that how have you seen this entire taboo thing being perceived, not only in the case, there are lots of stories about it and myths, everything, but these kind of taboos that have come through myths, and people are still hesitant of breaking them.
Peter, can I make a point here?
Yeah. Sure.
I have one thought about this whole cheese chena thing, and in a way it relates back to this topic of myths, because the problem is, some myths tend to become overriding, and we are often don't realize the extent to which we are influenced by this myth. And to me, to some extent, this whole question of cheese and dairy is because we are working under this myth that milk has to become cheese, which is actually a Northern European way of thinking. Whereas through much of the temperate world, including India, cheese becomes yogurt. It doesn't have to become milk. There is no, milk has to becomes yogurt. It doesn't have to become cheese. And this idea that, I wonder, I question why, when people say, why doesn't India have its own cheese? Why does India have to have cheese? We had yogurt, which was the natural way of using milk, excess milk products in a warm climate. In a cold climate, like Northern Europe, where yogurt cultures take time to form, it's more natural to make cheese rather than to make yogurt. So their culture that is where cheese comes from, naturally. And of course, they evolved all the wonderful types of cheese that we all enjoy. I'm not against cheese, but I'm just saying that in India, in a hot country like India, that the natural way of using excess milk is to make yogurt. And butter, even butter in India, Navneetam was traditionally made from yogurt, not from cream. So I'm just saying that, when we get in this issue of of, you know, why didn't we split milk, etc. Why did we have to split milk? Our normal natural way of using excess milk would have been to curdle it into yogurt.
Also, you know, to add to
So
what
therefore,
Vikram is saying,
if we come back to
splitting
the
milk-
point that storytelling traditions do shape our cuisines. It is through these myths and storytelling traditions that our cuisines are shaped. I mean, it brings us completely back to that point. Sorry, Kurush, you were saying something.
No, I was just saying that, you know, even the splitting milk thing, we don't have to split milk to make cheese.
Exactly.
This is a misconception that if you split the milk, it's cheese. I mean, cottage cheese is not really a cheese. I mean, let's be very honest. In the whole world of cheese, cottage cheese is not really much of a cheese. And I don't see a problem with either splitting milk or churning milk and doing all those things to it. Most of these myths that we have about spoiled milk and, you know, the upper caste, lower caste thing, these are urban traditions.
Yeah.
Nobody in their right mind in a rural, pastoral environment will waste anything. The milk splits, you make 10 out of it.
Yeah.
That's
You know,
exactly
yeah.
was my question to Shubhra.
So I have one thing I want to say here. Geography also comes in and plays a huge part, because the Indian cheeses you see, whether it's the Kalari of Kashmir or the Churpi, or in our parts in Uttarakhand, we use this plant rennet to, you know, break down goat's milk. It's all in the Himalayan regions where the temperature,
Which is cold.
yes,
Exactly.
cold,
Yeah,
exactly. It mirrors the Northern Europe,
Exactly.
you know, temperature. So hence you have that cheese making tradition. And I don't see any myths at play here. You know, like we live in a largely rural area, and every little thing is used up. And I mean, it's interesting that the milk is not even pasteurized. You know, we missed the pasteurization memo, you know, 120 years ago. So you just milk the cow. It's kept in these huge ceramic barnis, you know, jars, and over there it naturally becomes yogurt, and which is made into butter. And that is one process. And the other process is that you use this plant rennet, like a local, it's like a sap. It's a sap of a plant which you use to break down mostly goat's milk, which was done by the shepherds. Store milk when they were walking around, you know, grazing the sheep. They were in the higher climes. They had nowhere to store all the milk. So they would break it down, make it into cheese, and carry it with them. So it's always geography which is also playing
Absolutely.
a huge part.
Yeah.
You know, while talking about milk, there are so many hilarious milk myths. And the one common one that you will see everywhere is, you know, don't eat milk and fish together.
Ah, yes.
Absolutely.
The milk and fish thing is, you know, like a big thing. What I find really
But that
bizarre
is
about
common with the, again, if you connect the dots with the Jewish
kosher laws.
kosher laws.
But see, the Jewish kosher laws, they have no problem with fish and milk.
Yeah, they don't.
They they say you
With
can't
meat.
cook the milk and the meat together.
Meat together. But I'm drawing a comparison.
Yeah,
That,
completely.
you know, it was,
So what I find interesting is all over Bengal you'll have koi mach, and there will be no problem at all. The
we also have
Parsis
doodh tangra.
yeah,
Tangra mach cooked in milk.
precisely, and the Parsis actually have a ceremony where curd and milk, fried fish and curd are actually sent across from the boys' place to the girls' place and the girls' place to the boys' place before the wedding, in the run-up to the
And
wedding.
why so? Because both are auspicious.
Incredibly. And traditionally, rice, dal, curd, and fried fish are eaten together in Parsi homes across the board. So, you know, it's all a very interesting situation of where you can afford to do this. And
Also-
as Vikram said, you know, once the myth becomes a truth, then it's a different thing.
Also,
saying
as just to echo what Shubhra said about geography, I mean, why is fish and milk dairy products not combined through most of India's coast? Mainly because milk was never important along India's coastal regions. I mean, our milk product was coconut milk, which of course we use for fish in huge ways. Milk, cows are actually not suited to coastal areas, but water buffaloes are, which is
why the Portuguese and Bengal chena,
exactly.
but there's no Portuguese chena in Goa.
Yeah.
You
I
see
mean,
that?
there
It's
are
all
some
coconut
traditions
milk
of making it with goat milk, but
Yeah.
those have largely vanished. But yeah, milk was not an issue in coastal India. It's only now you know, with the white revolution, etc., that we have milk in some abundance in coastal regions. Otherwise, dairy milk was never a big product in coastal India. So, you know, that again echoes what Shubhra was saying about, you know, geography actually being a primary determinant of what we actually cook. But
So,
Shubhra, I want to hear you on pots also. Huh? Don't think I'm letting you go on pots.
You know, the one thing I've noticed again from traveling all around, the one thing I must say this, I'm boasting, but the one thing I can do is light a fire anywhere in any weather, because that's all we do. Okay, 10 years. Yeah, lost recipes. We've always cooked on wood fire.
I'm going to excuse myself for 2 minutes, guys.
Yeah.
Can you carry on? I'll come back just for 2 minutes.
Okay. So yeah, what I was saying is the one thing I can do is light a fire in any weather, whether it's raining or it's snowing or whatever it is, because that's the one thing I've learned. And we always cook on these either stoneware, or we cook on earthen pots, mostly earthen pots, because they're easy to find everywhere. And stone is difficult to carry. So when you're traveling for a shoot, you don't carry stone with you. And the one thing I've noticed is that the shapes across the country, you find similar shapes which are most used to cooking. And as for the food that is cooked now, because I haven't cooked myself, I don't know, you know, how much of the oil has got used or not, but from tasting what has been cooked in these pots, I can tell you there's a uniformity of flavor. There's no one particular masala which is screaming loudly over the others. Everything seems to, it's cooking at the same uniform temperature over a long period of time. So everything seems to have cooked into this homogeneous, beautifully flavored food. The food never screams out of a particular masala. There's nothing overpowering about it. You know, it's just beautifully melded, which is, I think, probably how it was meant to be. Which is, you know, when you cook a recipe, the same recipe in an earthen pot, and the same recipe in your kitchen, you know, in like a iron karai or in something else, the taste is different. Over here, you have certain flavors which stand out. Over there's a beautiful melding that happens. And another thing I've noticed is that in the rural areas, people still mirror the use of earthen pots, even if they're not cooking with earthen pots. For example, pressure cookers. There's a layer of mud which is applied on them before they're put on the chula. Always. So that, I think it's for the uniform distribution of heat, you know, and so that the cookers don't burn. I mean, they're all black at the end of it, but there's always this application of a mud lape on a pressure cooker. There's always the application of a mud lape on patilas, you know, or on kadhais in these rural areas. So I found that very interesting. And another thing I associate, sorry Preeta Didi, I'll just finish. Another thing I really associate with pots, because I've seen people, use them as such, is that the pot is very often believed to be like a, this is like in festivals, okay? In festivals, it is treated as the womb, the garb. So there is this mythological significance to the pot as being like a fertility figure, a fertility goddess, a womb or a garb in which they sow seeds, right, and also connected with Mother Earth. So that's another aspect of which I found, you know, in various cultures across the country.
Yeah, and you see pots appearing so often in Indian mythology. I mean, you know, Annapurna, of course, is very often shown with a pot and a ladle. I mean, there are other stories of Gandhari who puts the iron ball in a pot, and you know, there are so many associations. And you know, Preeta was asking me about Bombay and Bombay communities, and this suddenly reminded me of this one fascinating recipe that I found in this really amazing cookbook called The Indecisive Chicken. Which is this book that looks at the cooking lives of women in Dharavi, which of course has a large potters community. And the lady who had done this book, you know, actually worked with these women and really captured the ways in which they cook. And it's an amazing book because it really captures the cooking lives of very regular, ordinary women. And in many of them, you see what I said earlier, that the rural and the urban is not very different, because, you know, many of them, some of these women have come from small villages straight into Dharavi. And in Dharavi, in a sense, you're living like in a village, except it happens to be a village in the middle of this gigantic city. But one lady from the Kumbar community, the potters community, had this amazing recipe for Bengan Bhatta, which again is such a common Indian recipe. And she said that of course she roasts the Bengan, etc., like most people do, but to give it that earthy flavor, her recipe is she picks up a broken piece of pottery, because of course there always a broken pottery around, and she puts the pottery into the gas fire, the shard of pottery into the gas fire, and puts that actually into the bhatta. So that flavors the bhatta with its smoky taste, and then of course it's taken out before it's served. And to me, that was just another example of how pots and cooking in pots and the livelihood.
And there is a similar tradition in East Bengal, which is now
Really?
Bangladesh. Yes, yes, they make these little mud cakes, clay cakes, and this in some regions, and of course rural regions. I don't think the cities use it anymore. Maybe they do, and they drop it into the food.
Wow.
Wow.
So I think you're running out of time, and this is a never-ending discussion. Perhaps we should ask Arundhati and her team and Utkarsh that maybe we could have a part 2 to this. I don't want to leave, but I will have to leave. But my last question, I'm not going to let Vikram get away with only his pots story.
Sorry, I hijacked this discussion to talk about pots. Sorry about that.
There's one last question to you, that living in Bombay, you have observed these communities. Do you think that it is the festivals and the significance of food in each of these festivals that have bound a city like Mumbai together?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, at one level, it's yes, obviously yes, because festivals are seasons where we express ourselves through food, and it's where people get to experience each other. So if you're living in an apartment building and somebody and one flat from where the people in it are from one community is celebrating a festival, it's very natural to share some of the prasad and other dishes with other flats. And it's one way in which in a city like Bombay, different communities come together through the festivals. Again, for instance, like there's the way
each of the festival foods are foods that gods like.
Well, gods and humans, because that's a Hindu perspective. I mean, but from a Muslim perspective, for instance, during Ramzan, you have this huge now it's almost a tradition in Bombay of going to Muhammad Ali Road to eat iftar khana. I mean, I discourage people from doing it because actually the food is pretty horrible. Kurush will probably agree with me. You can get excellent food in Muhammad Ali Road and through the year. You don't have to go to like these completely commercial and really quite bad places that come up just to please gullible people during
it's business.
Yeah, and that's a mythology too. It's for young people, and if it gets young people to go to Muhammad Ali Road, a place most people in Bombay now shun, I think that's great. I mean, if for one time of the year you break your prejudices and you actually go to Muhammad Ali Road, if it's to eat bad iftar khana, well, that's good in itself. Unfortunately, it also happens that festival rituals can become a problem. We're seeing this every year through the whole tensions that come around Bakrid, for instance, and the slaughter of goats and the tensions around that. And it's a complicated issue, involving everything from neighborhood rights to animal rights to religious rights. So it's not easy to say. I mean, festivals can bring people together. And they do serve as ways in which people can tap into other cultures, but unfortunately they can also be used to divide.
True.
No, but this is so much so, Vikram, sometimes we don't realize that with such a large Hindu population, we do a lot of things in our country and we say this is the way because it's the Hindu way.
Yeah.
And it's not intentionally meant to be bad or something, it's just that the majority does it that way. Like Preeta said just now, that you make food that the gods love and you love. And if you look outside Hinduism, no, you don't make food that the gods love, you make food that you like.
Right.
And very often you have very specific things about food. I mean, you know, one of the great stupidities is not understanding the myth or the tradition behind Bakri Eid. The fact that you're not supposed to buy a goat 2 days before Bakri Eid, feed it and slaughter it. That's not the point. And Muslims doing that are completely missing the point. The point is sacrifice. You're supposed to keep that animal for an entire year. You have to love it. And then you have to kill it.
Yeah.
Then you understand what sacrifice means. It might sound very horrific, but young men in the family are made to do this growing up to learn what sacrifice means, what sacrifice meant, and what was sacrificed so that they could live the lives that they live today without fear of having to do the same to their children.
And to me, that you know, having to do it shows teaches you a certain respect for where your meat is coming from. When people
Completely.
who just go to shops and buy, you know, packets of frozen meat already cut from a freezer, you're not respecting the animal it comes from. You don't even think of it as an animal, which is the real problem. Whereas at least with the Bakri tradition, while parts of it may for outsiders seem really horrific, at least it is teaching you that your meat is coming from a living creature with a sentience and a life of its own, and which has to be killed, and you have to kill it to eat it. And to me, at least, however horrific that seems, it's teaching you something. Whereas people who eat meat without, you know, even thinking that it comes from an animal are really falling into a myth of a completely, you know, dangerous kind.
You know, these are modern food myths. These are the modern food myths, and this is what you've got to realize. The reason why offal is not eaten today, there was a time when offal was more prized than most of the cuts of meat. So, for example, brain, liver, kidneys cost way more than mutton cost. Today, very often, a lot of the body parts cost much less. But that was because you got a little bit of everything when an animal was slaughtered, before refrigeration, before the kind of urban systems we had in place. So, you know,
And it still exists, Purush.
in
I
the
have
rural areas,
discovered
it's still like
in
that.
the rural areas, it's still very much there in all
urban areas too.
communities across India. So we'll have to wrap up now. I'm sorry to rush you. Perhaps we can meet again. So ultimately, all the myths, the stories that we have behind each of our food systems actually all boil down to respect for our environment, respect for the cosmos, respect for life, and respect for relationships. So I think it's something that we need to go deep into to understand why we eat the way we do. It was because of who we are and who we wanted to be. Do you agree with me?
Absolutely. It's a lovely way to end. Thank you, Preeta.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
we'll end here. Thank you very much for being on the panel today. And we hope to continue this discussion another day.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.